So again, thank you all for being here this evening. We have a really great crowd for this evening. I think we'll have some good conversations. Hopefully you'll take a lot, or at least something out of kind of the event for tonight. My name is Gordy Sauer. I'm actually from the Dallas area. I grew up in Irving, and I was back there visiting my folks and doing a couple book events, one at the Allen Public Library and then one at Interrobang Books in downtown Dallas just last week for my first novel, which is Child in the Valley. It came out just a couple months ago at the end of August. And I had the extraordinary gift of having a blurb from the inimitable Larry McMurtry, which is just a wonderful thing. And then it's had some good things happen, I think, with the Dallas Morning News and other things. But basically, just to kind of give you a sense of the book, it's about a 17-year-old orphan in 1849 who flees his Missouri home and goes to California during the gold rush and deals with kind of questions of morality and violence and sexuality and other aspects of personal and kind of country growth on the frontier. It was a joy to write, but it did help me really kind of think about this idea of openings. And one of the things that I did in the book, which is partly where when Blake approached me about a class for writing workshops in Dallas, I started thinking about what a topic could be. One of the things I did was include a prelude, which is kind of, it's an approach that I think we're seeing more and more in fiction that's being published, but it is something that's a little bit old school. And so it just made me think about, what are the kinds of openings that are out there? How are people creating compelling openings? What does that look like? And what are some strategies to approach that moving forward? And so thus the class was born. So I kind of want to just dive right in and really, maximize the time that we have. So, to begin, I think, obviously, compelling openings are important because that's the very first thing that readers will encounter when, let me admit these two people, when they open your book. And so I do think that there are some concrete strategies that writers can use to really grip readers and bring them into the narrative. But before I really get to that, I want to just talk about the importance of openings on kind of a global scale, and then talk about the types of openings I think that you see, because I think being aware of the mechanisms that are available for us as writers is good, right? Do we want to use prologues? Do we want to just dive in with chapter one? Those are some considerations that I think that we should be working through as we write. So obviously on a very broad level, right? You want your opening to kind of do three things. You want it to get the reader's attention. That's kind of the first thing. You want to situate readers in the narrative that you are going to be building and that you are introducing by way of that opening. And then you want to give readers a sense of what's to come. I think those three things work in conjunction with each other, but they are also independently three very important parts of an opening, right? I mean, the introduction, I think, has to grab a reader's attention. I think great books, you often feel that pull when you first start reading them. And it seems kind of like a cosmic, like mystical pull, right? How does a writer create that? But again, there are some things that we can do to build that. So you want readers to feel that pull, but you also want them to feel grounded in the narrative, right? You don't want them to feel so disoriented that they are put off from that. When we think about the kinds of fiction that's out there, science fiction and fantasy, one of the things that I think is pretty marvelous is that even books that throw you into a world that you have no concrete relation to, right? Like George R.R. Martin's books, Game of Thrones are a really good example. Whatever he does in the beginning of his books, you feel grounded in that world and you feel grounded in that narrative. And that's a really powerful tool to be able to utilize as a writer, because without that, you lose a reader's not only interest, but you lose a reader's trust, right? And as soon as you lose the reader's trust and your ability to pull them through that narrative and help them carry along with the plot, that's when you start to have people kind of dropping off the page. So situating a reader in the narrative, is that second thing that's really important, and then giving a sense of what's to come. Questions that I think are important to ask yourself when you're trying to give a reader a sense of what's to come. You want readers to kind of have a sense of what they can expect from the book, right? This is getting to this issue of stakes. Is this going to be a book that is a little bit darker, right? Is this going to be a book that is a little bit whimsical? Are the stakes as high as life and death, or are they, a little bit lower? You want them to be able to have a sense of why they should keep reading, right? You're asking a reader to devote hours, days, weeks to a book. So you're asking for a very significant investment of their life. And you want them to feel from those opening pages that that investment is worth their time, right? I hate to talk about writing as like a financial endeavor, but obviously, right, writers want to get paid, right? Which means you want readers to buy the books that you write. And so you want them to feel like that investment, both in the concrete dollars that they turn over for your book, but also in terms of their time, is worth it, because that keeps them coming back for more. The last thing that I'll say, and this is kind of a little added bit, consider the front matter, right, of a book in kind of conjunction with your opening. So, when we pick up books, there's often that material in the front matter, they call it, right? The epigraph, which are the quotes that you might bring in from other books. Maybe there are things like there's like a map or an illustration, right? Publishers call this the front matter. It's not something that's essential to a book. I mean, you do see a lot of books without epigraphs, without front matter. But if you are thinking about incorporating some of those things, I do think it's important to think about what the relationship is between the front matter and the first few pages, right? How is that front matter going to help set the tone for some of those first few pages? How, if you do include a map, you want them to get a sense of early on, what is that map's purpose? I know, to go back to Game of Thrones, there's a big map in his, first few pages, the front matter of the book, and it's very clear early on the role that map plays. So that's something I think that the front matter is something I think that is a little bit ancillary to crafting a compelling opening, because it is kind of a separate thing. But I do think that really understanding how all the components of your book work together, so that you think about your book as this, holistic artifact, and that every page is working to carry a reader forward, is just important, because everything that they're going to see in those initial pages is really going to set the stage for what they're going to experience, how they're going to experience it, and whether they will keep going moving forward. So that's the beginning, the importance of openings. Types of openings is the second thing that I want to address. Really, I think you have two types. The chapter 1 opening, kind of the jump right in, and then prologue, which I think prologues can be broken down into two sort of thematic areas. The first is, I would call it a layering prologue, right? So this is a prologue that readers will come back to, or that will make more sense as the book goes along. So it's almost like you are clipping out kind of a coupon from the middle of the book or the end of the book and putting it at the front to grab a reader's attention, knowing that what they're reading, even if they don't fully understand it in the first few pages, they will understand it as the book goes along, right? So that's, I like to call that a layering prologue, because it's helping the book become built overall, and it's helping, I think, readers make sense of the book holistically as they go along. A really good example of a layering prologue is from this book called Bearskin. It's by a writer, James A. McLaughlin. It won the Edgar Award for first novel. It's kind of a literary thriller just a couple of years ago. And I'm not going to read the entire prologue, but you can see that essentially what McLaughlin does is he winds up italicizing his flashbacks and throughout the book. And so really what this prologue is it's a flashback that he's pulled out from the book and inserted it in the front. And you come to find out that it's a flashback of the character in a jail cell after he is arrested for trafficking drugs on the border, which becomes significant as the book goes along, and you start to figure out, why this main character is living alone in the mountains in Virginia. Why is his history, so kind of fraught and difficult? So that's a layering prologue. Somebody said, don't prologues have a bad rap these days? Yeah, that's a good question. I think that I'll answer that. And I am happy to address questions as we go along too. But so short answer, I'll say no. Actually, I think that, the idea of something in fiction having a bad rap is, I don't think we should think about it that way. I think we can think about stylistic tendencies as fluctuating in fiction, right? And so prologues and preludes certainly had their heyday in early 20th century, 19th century fiction. There is a little bit of a comeback now where you see prologues and preludes popping up in fiction. It is still, though, kind of an old school technique. And, so one of the things I did say early on, I actually do have a prelude in my first book. And it was something that the publisher, after I sold it to them, said that if I hadn't had that, they would have recommended it because they've seen this kind of newfound flair to bring preludes and prologues back. For me, the question of whether to include a prologue or not, I tend to have the practice of always starting without a prologue. And then if I feel like the book warrants that, I will go back and put that in. And that's predominantly because I tend to be a pretty sequential writer, starting at page 1 and kind of moving forward throughout the book. So, I think if you're deciding on whether to include a prologue or a prelude, I think it all boils down to the way that you're using that prologue or that prelude. And what I would recommend is that you remove that prologue from the opening and see if you feel like your opening is compelling enough without it. And if the answer is yes, then you could probably serve to not include it in there. If you feel like including the prologue adds a dimension to the book by layering it, or you feel like the prologue is just better written, then put it in there. So to get back, we talked about layering prologues. The second kind of prologue, I'll call an isolated prologue. This is something that popped up more in kind of the postmodern era of fiction, sort of the 1960s and beyond. It's more of an interesting literary choice. You see it more in literary fiction than you do in more kind of plot-driven or genre-based fiction. And really what an isolated prologue is it serves a very specific purpose, but it's not meant to be taken in the context of the story as a whole. It's almost like a stepping stone that you use to walk into the house, right? It's like that threshold. So you have to step up onto the threshold to go in, but it's not essential for you to be able to see the entirety of the house, because once you're in the house, you don't need to have that threshold. Everything in the house is there for you. So a good example of an isolated prologue is from this Irish writer named Toni French, who writes a lot of literary detective fiction. And her book is called In the Woods. And I say that this is a good example because really what this prologue is doing is it's situating you in the context of this Irish kind of remote setting and giving you a window into the detective's head. But nothing in the prologue itself affects the actual book. It's basically just a little bit of character building and a little bit of scene setting. And so I'll read you kind of the first couple lines so you can get a sense of that. Picture a summer stolen whole from some coming-of-age film set in small-town 1950s. This is none of Ireland's subtle seasons mixed for a connoisseur's palate, watercolor nuances within a pinched-sized range of cloud and soft rain. This is summer full-throated and extravagant in a hot, pure silkscreen blue. This summer explodes on your tongue, tasting of chewed blades of long grass, your own clean sweat, Marie biscuits with butter squirting through the holes, and shaken bottles of red lemonade picnicked in tree houses. Interestingly, I think the prologue is actually kind of disorienting, right? I mean, there's a lot of language going on in here. There's a lot of language play. There's a direct address, right? The picture a summer stolen whole from some coming of age film set in small town 1950s. You're not being situated in a character's mind or in a plot. You're actually just being told this is what you should be thinking about. And I think why this prologue is so interesting is because what you find out is that the detective who you read in first person as the book goes along, this is sort of their mantra early on. And you start to figure out why this detective who's thinking about his own history would give you this information as a prologue. And it's predominantly because it helps you understand his frame of mind as a detective. So I would call that an isolated prologue expressly because it has no bearing on the plot. It's really there to just kind of give you a little bit more depth in terms of character and in terms of setting. C.G. Parker asked, would this also be essentially the same as a framing device, such as the manuscript? Exactly. Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think we could think about it in that way. It just comes in the opening, so it's called a prologue. But yes, it is a sort of framing device, and prologues are a sort of framing device, right? The second kind of opening, obviously, is chapter one, which chapter one is really the much more kind of conventional jump right in, first sentence, first paragraph, first chapter. This is, I think, the kind of opening that a lot of the strategies that we talk about today will really adhere to. They do adhere to prologues, yes, but I think these strategies that we're going to talk about today are really fitting for chapter one because they help readers find ways to put information in the first chapter readers need to have while also capturing the reader's attention to continue moving forward. 2 words of advice. Don't focus on impressing readers. I think that that's something that I often struggle with as a writer. I get so wrapped up in first lines, first paragraphs that I find really captivating, that I find myself being stymied by just starting a book. You don't have to knock a reader's socks off. Some of the best openings in my mind are some of the most simple. And I'll give you an example. These are the first sentences of some really powerful books. Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian, see the child. That's the first line, see the child. I think that that's such a powerful first line, because it gives you a character from the outset, right? And it gives you a moment in that character's life, see the child. It also impresses upon you the need to look and to pay attention. And I think what McCarthy's doing just in that first line is setting up the entire frame for the novel, which is a very visual novel, and a novel that is filled with a lot of judgment from readers on the characters and on the incidents that are happening. Second example, Marilyn Robinson's Housekeeping. My name is Ruth. That's her first line. It's very simple, and it's actually very understated. And I think that is such a powerful example of how a writer can capture the quality, the tone, and the breadth of their novel just in 3 or 4 words. My name is Ruth. It does obviously give you a main character, and it gives you that character's name, but it also suggests a kind of intimacy, right? It's a character who's introducing themselves to you as a reader, which automatically pulls you in because you start feeling like this is going to be a novel where you're going to develop a companionship with this character, right? You're going to develop an attachment. And so whatever happens in that novel is going to affect you profoundly, and it really does. The last line that I'll give you, an interesting first sentence, is from a newer novel, Ian McGuire. He's a British writer who wrote this book called The North Water. And this is his second book called The Abstainer. And the opening sentence is midnight. Literally, it's just that one word, midnight. And I honestly think that there's no single word in the English language that can evoke so much in terms of the depth of its meaning than the word midnight. And so to open almost like a play where you're just giving the reader a sense of the time of day, but with such a kind of deep and heavy word, it just really carries you forward. And the rest of the book has that kind of heaviness and has that kind of depth. So again, you know, I don't think that any of these three writers were thinking, I really want to create this like bang out pow first line. They were just starting, right? And I think that capacity to just start is really, really critical. Strategies for crafting compelling openings. I want to talk about 4, okay? I'll give all 4 to you and then I'll break them down. The first one is going to be tone. The second one is going to be moment. So like, this is the moment. The third is going to be rooting, R-O-O-T-I-N-G, like rooting. And then the fourth is going to be possibility. I came up with these. So if you feel like they should be labeled differently, feel free to label them differently. So I want to start with tone. And I'm using these words, tone, moment, rooting, and possibility, as opposed to traditional craft terms like setting, character, mood, because I think that they capture more what an opening should do, right? Craft elements are important, but understanding how craft elements operate, that's what these tones are trying to convey. So tone, moment, rooting, and possibility. Tone, I think, is the most important. I think the best openings open with a strong sense of tone. You know from the feel, the mood of that opening, what exactly this book is going to offer, right? The right tone is everything. It tells a reader what their reading experience will be like from the beginning to the end of the book. Because as much as other things change, character, plot, the tone is often the most consistent, right? When you pick up a romantic book, or when you pick up a thriller, you know the tone of that. Someone asked me, are tone and voice the same thing? I would argue that tone and voice are very complementary, but I think that they are different. I think tone is the feel of the book, whereas voice is the rhythm of the book, right? They are operating toward the same goal. So the rhythm of the book has to match the feel of the book, right? So McCarthy's voice, to use a really kind of prominent example, matches his tone. It's a heavy rhythm. It's a biblical rhythm. It's weighted by a lot of kind of archaic, big vocabulary, which matches his heavy, sort of ancient, almost like primordial tone, right? So they do have to work hand in hand, but I think rhythm and feel are doing slightly different things in terms of a book. Even without knowing what will happen in a book, tone gives readers an indication of how it will happen. Will it be whimsical? Will it be romantic? Will it be brutal, right? Is it violent? Is it haunting? Is it mysterious? That's why, for me, tone is the absolute most important thing that you need to establish from that first sentence. And, you know, to give you a little bit of an anecdote, I'm trying to write my second book right now. And I've had quite a lot of false starts with the opening of that second book. And the reason is because I don't feel like I've landed on the tone. I hit one tone and I felt like it was a little bit too heavy and a little bit too dark. I hit another tone and it felt to me like it was a little too playful. It's, for me, I think once I hit that tone, that's when I have the beginning of the book, because I know that's the feel of it, the mood, and I can keep going to carry readers forward. So tone, I think, is the most important. The second strategy is moment. This isn't the when, right? It's not time, it's not the when, but it's to what end? That's kind of the question that the second strategy is addressing. To what end? To what end does the tense that you're writing the book in present voice, to get to the question that was asked? To what end does tense present storytelling? To what end does your opening give a sense of the power, the momentum in the book, right? This is the moment. To what end will the book move, right? You're kind of giving a sense of whether the book will be chronological, right? So to go back to the McCarthy example, see the child, you know since you're starting at the beginning of this character's life, the book can only go forward, right? That's the moment. You know which direction the book is going to go. To go back to that prologue I read with Tana French, you know that the book is going to have some back and forth because you're being asked to picture a moment in the 1950s, right? So you have a sense of how the book is going to vacillate between past and present. So the moment in those opening pages is really, really important. I want to give you an example of that, and then I'll read an example for tone. So Gabriel Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude, I think is a really great opening for establishing moment. This is a long first sentence because Marquez is a long sentence writer. Many years later, as he faced the firing squad, Colonel Arelando Buendia was to remember that distant afternoon when his father took him to discover ice. At that time, Macondo was a village of 20 adobe houses built on the bank of a river of clear water that ran along a bed of polished stones, which were white and enormous, like prehistoric eggs. Okay. Sorry. Okay, so I think why that's so good for moment, you know, two things. You know that this book has kind of an epic scope, right? Many years later is the opening line. As he faced the firing squad, so you also know that a character is dying in the beginning, but that you're probably going to get that character's backstory before he dies. Colonel Arelando Buendia was to remember that distant afternoon when his father took him to discover ice. That alone tells you this book wavers in this almost like surrealistic realm, right? The idea of discovering ice is something that isn't quite grounded in the reality that we know. And what we know from Marquez is that he's a magical realist writer. So we know a few things about this book. We know it's got this epic scope. We know we're going to be dealing with life and death. We know we're going to be following characters throughout their trajectories. We also know that the scope of the book is going to intersect with the present in these really abrupt ways, because as soon as we go from him facing the firing squad, we go back to this idea of Macondo, a village of 20 adobe houses being built along a creek with a bed of polished stones, which were white and enormous, like prehistoric eggs. So you go from this kind of contemporary moment all the way back in history by the end of the second sentence, right? That's the moment. And the fact that it's so broad and so expansive tells us a lot about what's in store for us in the book. Okay. To give you an example of tone. Toni Morrison's Beloved. I think Toni Morrison is an incredible tone writer. Here's her opening first couple lines. 124 was spiteful, full of a baby's venom. The women in the house knew it, and so did the children. For years, each put up with the spite in his own way, but by 1873, Seth and her daughter Denver were its only victims. We know this is not going to be the lightest book that we've picked up, right? We also know that this book is going to do some incredible things with thinking about grief, with thinking about death, with thinking about place and the context of those things. Just the opening line, 124 was spiteful, right? That word spiteful tells us so much about the power of this book, full of a baby's venom. So again, you have these kind of like competing ideologies, right? You have this sort of newness, the supposed innocence, right? The novelty of a baby with venom, right? Which we associate with parasites, which we associate with like snakes, toxins, right? Evil. I mean, you know, that kind of clash, right? That sets the tone for the book. And I think that by doing that, you know exactly what you're entering into. And you're also really intrigued, right? What is this book going to show me that I haven't seen before? And I think tone really offers that. So those are the first two, tone and moment. The second two is a little bit more getting into kind of the practicalities of craft, rooting, okay? I like to call it rooting because I like to think about it literally as like planting a root, right? I mean, you're rooting a reader in that text, out of which the book will grow and expand like a tree, right? I mean, you are rooting a reader there so that they are staying in place for you to carry them throughout the journey of the tree that is the book, okay? I believe that disruption is the start of any great story, okay? You are always starting with disruption. I think that's different than disorientation, right? But if you think about it, all great books, all great stories, movies, etc., they begin by disrupting the status quo, okay? Readers are reading about a moment that is pushing characters into a life that they didn't have before, or they're reading about, a death, which is disrupting, or they're reading about a character facing a firing squad, or they're reading about victims, right? I mean, disruption is the crux of all great stories, because without disruption, you don't have the evolution of character, the evolution of plot, right? Disruption is what starts the cycle for things going on. And we see that in life, right? I mean, when you read, like, listen to, see true crime stories or stuff, right? There's that moment of disruption, which upends lives. And that's what starts the story that we're kind of hearing about. So would moving from one country to another be an example of disruption? Yes, right? I mean, disruption doesn't have to be cataclysmic, right? But disruption is taking change in a character's life that will fundamentally put them on a path they have not been on before, right? So their life was going down path A, disruption causes it to go down path B, and path B is where the story is, because everything that happens after the moment of disruption has to be them dealing with those happenings, right? It has to be them either reconciling their new life with their old life or failing to reconcile their new life with their old life. And that's fiction, right? I mean, that's what all fiction is, that reconciliation or that failure to reconcile, right? That's all fiction is. So disruption in rooting. Rooting is not just setting, it's literally that. It's situating a reader in a time, a place, an arena. It's establishing the roots of the book strong enough for it to grow. I think that part of rooting are all of those craft considerations that we traditionally hear about: character, setting, time, right? All of that is embroiled in this idea of rooting, because that's what has to happen for readers to really be able to move forward, right? They have to have a sense of character. They have to have a sense of time in the book. They have to have a sense of the setting. These are all the elements of rooting for a character to be able to move forward. This is what makes a reader feel grounded, right? Because when you start with disruption, which all fiction does, you have to immediately ground a reader in the context of that disruption so that they don't feel disoriented, right? Again, this is why readers keep reading, because they feel grounded. They have to trust you so that you can carry the book forward. So I want to give you an example of disruption. This is a collection of short stories. This author, Tom Franklin, teaches at the University of Mississippi. It's called Poachers. Okay, Poachers is the titular novella in this collection, which was published in a literary journal, but also in here. So I'll read the first paragraph, because I think this gives a really strong sense of rooting: character, time, setting, place. At dawn on the first day of April, the three Gates brothers banked their 10-foot aluminum boat in a narrow slough of dark water. They tied their hounds, strapped on their rifles, and stepped out, ducking black magnolia branches heavy with rain and Spanish moss. The two thin younger brothers, denim overalls tucked into their boots, lugged between them a styrofoam cooler of iced fish, coons, and possums. The oldest brother, 20, bearded, heavy-set, carried a sunbeam bread sack of eels in his coat pocket. Hooked over his left shoulder was the pink body of a fawn they'd shot and skinned, and over the right, a stray dog to which they'd done the same. With the skins and heads gone and the dog's tail chopped off, they were difficult to tell apart. It's a powerful, powerful first paragraph, and I think it does an incredible job of rooting. You have a really strong sense of character, right? I mean, even though these characters are nameless, you feel like you know them. You feel like you have a sense of what they're capable of. You have a very strong sense of place, right? Descriptives like narrow slough of dark water, 10-foot aluminum boat. They have rifles, black magnolia branches, heavy with Spanish moss, right? All of this is rooting us in the narrative. And then, of course, the most powerful part of this opening, the image at the end of the dead fawn and the dead dog looking exactly the same, skinned and with the dog's tail cut off. I mean, that's haunting, right? And so it really is rooting us in what the story is doing and what the story is capable of. LH asks, what if the narrator is trapped or dead and reflecting? Can disruption be a disruption to the reader, i.e. not expecting to start the book in this way? In short, yes, right? I mean, I think that ultimately what you should think about, right, when you are starting with this idea of disruption is, how is disruption not disruption for the reader? How is it disruption for the characters, for the story? Right? You're not disrupting the reader. What you're doing is you're disrupting the characters, you're disrupting the setting, you're disrupting the story, because that's where the disruption is going to play out in the story. It's not going to play out in the reader's head. The reader is along for the ride. The disruption is the characters having to deal with that disruption. So, to this question of what if the narrator is trapped or dead and reflecting, the disruption is for the narrator, right? It's the narrator trying to contend with the circumstances that they've been forced into. How are they going to get out? What are they going to do? So the disruption shouldn't be to the reader. It's, how is the reader experiencing the disruption in that character? Okay, the last strategy, possibility. By the time they get to the end of that first paragraph, right? And really, this often happens even by the end of the first sentence, or at the very least, by the end of the first chapter or prologue, readers need to have a sense of possibility, right? They need to have a sense of what can happen. This doesn't mean they need to know what will happen. Obviously, that's not the point, but they need to have a sense of what is possible. These are the stakes, right? What are the confines in which your story will take place? This is to come back to the idea I talked about in the beginning. Not all books have to be life and death, right? But when you set out to write a book, what you're ultimately doing is you're establishing the confines of those stakes, right? If it is a matter of life and death, that's one thing. But for instance, Marilynne Robinson's housekeeping, the confines are these orphan children going to live with an estranged aunt. Well, there's a lot that can happen in that story. It's not necessarily a life and death story, but we know that it's not a life and death story. And that helps us sort of whittle down our expectations, which also actually expands how we think of possibility, because then we start to pay attention to the minutia of domesticity, which is really what that book is about, right? Housekeeping, and the power of that minutia in the book overall. So giving a reader a sense of what these confines are, right? What the limitations are by virtue of what your story is going to offer them, that's possibility. Readers really have to have a sense of possibility. And again, when we think of possibility, the closest kind of traditional craft technique that we tie to that is plot, right? They have to have a sense of how the story is going to progress. There are a lot of, I think, really good plot-driven books that offer this, but I want to read just the first paragraph, which is the first line in Stephen King's It, to really show us kind of how this happens. The terror, which would not end for another 28 years, if it ever did end, began, so far as I know or can tell, with a boat made from a sheet of newspaper floating down a gutter swollen with rain. That is a really incredible first sentence. And it's a first sentence that is just infused with so much possibility, right? We open with this idea of terror, but we also have a first-person narrator who's reflecting on that terror, which tells us that this is a story that we're going to be told through experience. I think terror is often framed more interestingly through that regard, right? And then, you open with this idea of terror, and then you finish with this image of a paper boat floating down a gully swollen with rainwater, right? Which is a very naive, whimsical, childlike image. And of course, knowing Stephen King, that's what he does, right? He mashes those two things together, childness, naivete, whimsicality, childlike experiences with really kind of horror and haunting circumstances. But there's so much possibility in that, because the dominating question is, what is going to happen when these two things collide? Because we know they haven't collided yet. We also know that they will collide, because that's what the book tells us. It began with the terror, and the terror began with this boat floating down a gutter swollen with rainwater, right? We also have a real clear sense of the stakes. And this is a situation where it is life and death, but it's also a situation of like lost innocence, right? And like child sabotage. And I think that that's where stakes are more complicated than just being life and death, because life and death is like a pretty broad way to think about stakes. You know, for this is child life and death, which is a very different stake than adult life and death. I mean, we all feel that differently, right? We feel the impact of death in childhood differently than we do death in adulthood. And so that's, you know, raising the bar a little bit with some of the stakes. So these are really the four strategies that I think make compelling openings: tone, moment, rooting, and possibility. And just to kind of like wrap up my section, and then I want to leave some time for some questions and stuff, and, you know, expand on anything that you want me to expand on. There's a book by Fernando Flores, Tears of the Truffle Pig, which is kind of a magical realist book. It's set in Texas, down in South Texas, along the border. He's a Mexican-American writer. He was born in Mexico, but then grew up in South Texas. And there's a kind of absurdity to the book. It's about almost an alternate reality where two border walls are built down on the South Texas border. But I just want to open with reading the first full paragraph, because I think it captures, you know, all four of these strategies. And that's the goal, right? Is that tone, moment, rooting, possibility have to happen together in the opening paragraphs and opening first chapters to really pull readers in and draw them along. Bellacosa walked carefully over the rotting planks, unsure if this was the shack where he was born. Its roof was missing, and he looked up at the aluminum sky. It hadn't caved in, so he figured some South Texas zephyr galloped away with it. He stomped down hard, and fine orange dust lifted and formed a ghost in his own image, eager to dance or play cards, then sank back down to the cracks. He lit a Herzegovina floor cigarette and murmured, "Somebody out there isn't doing their job," noticing he dirtied his authentic ostrich knee Wingham dress shoes. He tried to imagine what the place could have looked like all those decades ago, where his mother gave birth, what the hustling midwife looked like, where his father stood wringing his hat. The shack was small, as he'd expected. He didn't know why, but he thought there'd be no floor. The planks surprised him. I think that opening paragraph really does a whole lot, right? The tone, again, you know, you have this sort of tone that suggests some confrontation, right? It suggests some kind of unexpectedness. It's also a tone that feels very modern, right? I mean, you have Herzegovina floor cigarette, you have the Wingham dress shoes. So you have this modernness that is juxtaposed to the ruralness and sort of timelessness of the shack that he's visiting, right? You also have a strong sense of rooting. I mean, you have this main character who's examining his birthplace, but also kind of, you know, put off by it and surprised by it. I mean, there's an interesting question of what is his history? What does that mean for kind of who he is now, how he's going to move forward? You have a really strong moment in that, right? He's in the shack in which he was born. I think that in itself is a very powerful moment. And then, of course, you have a lot of possibility, because questions that pop up to me are, why is this character coming to his birthplace after all these years? Why is it abandoned, right? Why is the language of a South Texas zephyr galloping away with the sky? What does that have to do with this really seemingly rural kind of desolate place? So you're going to get a lot of this kind of mashup as the book goes along. And, you know, it carries a little bit of comedic possibility, right? Because you have the image of the dust coming up in his image and then falling back down. And of course, dust doesn't rise up that way. So there's a way in which the reader is introducing us to this idea of absurdity and like comedic possibility, because they're going to allow things to happen in a way that doesn't happen in real life. So that's good, strong first opening. There was a question here that I'll address before I open the floor again. Does an opening first paragraph or page have to answer everything? Of course it can leave questions, absolutely. I don't think that you should think of an opening as posing answers. I think you should think of an opening as posing a situation, right? Writers should never be striving to create mystery by virtue of questions. Writers should be striving to create mystery by virtue of the fact that they have woven together a situation so tight, readers want to know what's going on with it, right? If you are omitting details deliberately just to create mystery, you're not doing enough to, I think, root a reader in the situation to build mystery organically. And I think that really, like, great mystery writers do this, right? There are details that are omitted, but they're not omitted explicitly. It's not like they're kept intentionally from a reader by virtue of a reader naturally stumbling upon them. Great mystery, I think, asks questions in the fact that so much is possible. And what we don't know is which of those possibilities is happening. That's I think, where great mystery comes from. So I'll pause there, or I'll stop there and open the floor to questions. You're welcome, if you want to drop them in the chat, or if you would rather unmute and ask them, that's okay too.
Hi, I have a question. My name is LaForest.
Hi there. Yes.
I was wondering how much of this applies to creative nonfiction.
I think all of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and in fact, here, I'll give you a good example. So this is from Creative Nonfiction, Pilgrim at Tinker Creek by Annie Dillard. This is actually 3 of her memoirs, but all of it. I think the same rules apply, especially if you're thinking of creative nonfiction as in like memoir. I think if you're thinking of creative nonfiction like criticism, that's very different, because that's not building story, that's conceptual. But if you're thinking of creative nonfiction as memoir, so this is the first paragraph in her memoir. I used to have a cat, an old fighting Tom, who would jump through the open window by my bed in the middle of the night and land on my chest. I'd half awaken. He'd stick his skull under my nose and purr, stinking of urine and blood. Some nights he kneaded my bare chest with his front paws, powerfully, arcing his back as if sharpening his claws or pummeling a mother for milk. And some mornings I'd wake in daylight to find my body covered with paw prints and blood. I looked as though I'd been painted with roses. Yeah. So I think it does all of those things, right? There's an incredible tone, rooting, moment, possibility. So I think this absolutely applies to that aspect of creative nonfiction. Thank you. You're welcome. Who is the author of the book I just read? Annie Dillard. Annie Dillard. Yeah, this is called 3 by Annie Dillard, but the book I read from was Pilgrim at Tinker Creek, which she won the Pulitzer Prize for back in the 70s, I believe. It is incredibly graphic. You're right. Yeah. After the course, could you share, please, the books you referenced? Yes, I can do that. Let me see if I can type them in the chat, and then I'll keep talking while I do that. As far as the hero's journey, I feel like starting before the decision is made to leave isn't compelling enough. Yet I feel starting with the protagonist already away from home and then going back in flashbacks for the reasons why might not be the best place. So thoughts. Okay, so this is a good question. It's about where to begin, right? And I think that's important. I think that there are a lot of different ways, obviously, and a lot of different decisions that go into where to start in terms of a hero's journey. And I think, what it all boils down to is, what do readers need to know as far as the history of that character in the hero's journey? And I'll give you two kind of very different examples, right? So my book is kind of a Western, kind of an anti-Western, but it actually begins with the birth of the main character on a steamship going south to St. Louis, right? So that's the earliest moment that you could start in a character's life. And then I call it kind of an anti-hero narrative because it's actually a character who descends in terms of the choices he makes throughout the book. There's another book by Ming Su. It's a new book called by Tom Lin. It's called The Thousand Crimes of Ming Su, which is also a Western, also published this year. And it begins with the character who has already become an assassin and has already killed the first person as an assassin. So all of that to say, Tom Lin felt like he didn't need to start with all of this backstory. He could jump right in terms of where the character is at that moment in the character's life. And it's a powerful way to begin. That didn't work for me, right? I felt like I had to go back to the beginning. And that was partly because I was more focused on how a character would go from being good to being bad. And so I wanted to build up that goodness, which was happening at the early parts of his life. So it's a complicated question, but I think that it's one that considers all those things. I hope that answers it. Could I save the chat? I'll try to do that. Yeah, could you email the list? Oh, and then somebody asked that. I may have a piggyback question on this. Aaron asked. Aaron, did you want to ask that? Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. So I where I'm starting as of now, the main character kind of is like, he's thrown into a situation where he doesn't have any control and not very much knowledge of what's going on. And when I write it, obviously, like right now, it's nobody has any knowledge, or like rooting is probably like my biggest issue. And I'm trying to figure out, if I were to continue going along with that, what would, do you have any advice on how to keep it without giving too much, because the character himself is in this situation, but still let the reader not be like completely confused and lost?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. So, okay, so you're asking me, tell me that again. You're asking me.
So like the character himself is like both like doesn't have control over his body, like he's like been almost like assumed,
okay,
and also like very limited like memory. And that's where it kind of like dives into the story. But like the way I've written it so far, it's super convoluted. And like when I've had some people read it, I was in one of the other workshop classes, and like the biggest note was like, hey, we all feel kind of unmoored. Like this sounds cool and there's cool stuff, but like we're all just kind of also very confused with him, as opposed to watching him be confused.
So you're dealing with a couple of things there. One, it sounds like you're dealing a little bit with unreliable narrator situation, right? Okay. And that is complicated, right? Because that creates external disruption, right? That can disrupt a reader. And there are books that are written through unreliable narrators. One of them is, let me think on that really quickly. That's interestingly a technique that you don't, that is a very kind of postmodern technique. I think the other thing that you're dealing with, obviously, is that in some ways, this may be a question of kind of language and actually sort of slowing things down deliberately. Because I think often what can happen when we begin a book is that we want to create intrigue by creating uncertainty or mystery. And the truth is that the more concrete and the more clear that you can just be in that opening, these are the things that are happening. This is the character, right? The more direct you can be, which all of these books are very direct, there's mystery and the possibility. And so, Aaron, probably my advice to you would be to step back a little bit and maybe just focus on like describing a scene as the opening very concretely to kind of root readers in that possibility. Don't get too much in the character's head in that moment. Maybe just have the character doing something, even if it's a mundane something like going to the grocery store and then watching a robbery happen, or watching a clerk, have to fight with a customer over the final bill, right? Something that just is very sort of connection oriented for a reader to push them forward into the scene and help them carry it forward. And then those ideas of unreliability and stuff can filter as you're moving throughout. So I hope that's helpful.
Definitely. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Monty had said to start as close to the climax as you realistically can, which seems like a pretty good strategy in general. Yeah, you know, I mean, absolutely. Vonnegut's an incredible writer, or was an incredible writer. I think that I don't think you have to do that, right? I don't think that you should think of any of these things, any of advice like that as rules. I think thinking about it as guidance is good, right? I mean, that is the sort of like Aristotelian model of plays too, right? In media res, beginning in the middle of things, because that gets as close to the climax as possible. But obviously you see really powerful books. I mean, you know, Lonesome Dove is a good example where you're not really anywhere near the climax, right? I mean, you're about like 500-600 pages kind of away from it, even more. So I think thinking of the climax as one moment in a book is good in terms of thinking of a book's structure holistically and as an arc. But the fact is that you always have these kind of like minor climaxes throughout where characters are having to reconcile little things as they're going along, and that's pushing them further and further toward the major climax. So maybe a better way to think of that is starting at a point where one of those minor moments isn't too far away, because that's what's going to keep a book going, right? Probably, yeah. Does that answer the question? I hope that answers the question. So I dropped in, and I did save the chat. Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that you'll notice when you get into looking at all the different kinds of openings out there are the ways to approach where to begin are radically diverse, but the strategies in those openings, regardless of where they begin, are all boiling down to these capacities of tone, moment, rooting, and possibility. All of them do that regardless of where they begin. And I think that's why my advice is generally just get started, right? And focus on these strategies. And you can always move things around in the book or go back to different moments of where you want to begin and stuff. But if you have the tone, the moment, the rooting, and the possibility, the book has legs, because that's the kind of stuff that carries a reader forward. So I hope that's it. I know we're at our time now. I just want to thank you again for being here. Last thing in the chat was I'm trying to get a literary agent and know that the opening paragraph is key, and that's absolutely right. Yeah, that's true. So hopefully this gives you a sense of what compelling openings can do, how to kind of craft them, you know, and thank you again for being here and being part of the discussion. Have a good night.
Thank you.